Hey guys, so today we're talking about the middle colonies, and the middle colonies encompass New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. Here's a little map of them. If you will see, what we know now as Vermont was part of New York and kind of New Hampshire, which is going to be a northern colony, but New York is a middle colony. So some characteristics that they all share, they're pretty great at farming in this area, and their soil is very fertile and apt for growing grains such as wheat, barley, and oats. And they'll actually become known as the bread colonies because they'll be exporting a bunch of bread to the other colonies, the North and South, as well as to England and the West Indies, where the soil is not so great to be farming such an important food staple. They also, part of their economy is going to be trading and shipping and fishing, all because of the three rivers that some of them are on the map to your right there, the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson. And these are great for trapping furs like beavers. They're great for transportation, great for trade, great for fishing, and mostly great for exploration. You ride that river up into the interior, even all the way up into the Appalachian Mountains, and it's much easier to explore these colonies. This area is going to be seen as less aristocratic than the North or the South. In the North, we had a very wealthy merchants and traders and manufacturers, and in the South, we have very wealthy landowners. And in the middle, we have people with smaller farms, less money. I guess you could say more middle class, although a middle class doesn't really exist at this point. With the exception of New York is going to become very chic and very ritzy and aristocratic. We call them the middle colonies not only because they're in the middle geographically, but they're in the middle when it comes to industry as well. So in the North, we had a lot more manufacturing and shipping and trading. In the South, we had none of that and mostly the slave trade and farming. In the middle, it's smack dab in the middle. Fewer industries than the North, but more than the South. And some of those industries are shipbuilding, lumbering, shipping, commerce, and finance. Also, in these middle colonies, we are going to see a more ethnically mixed crowd. And when we mix more people, there's usually more tolerance. We're going to see a lot of democratically controlled areas as well. So again, that's just due to more ethnic mixing. So the first colony we're going to discuss is actually New York, and New York was not started by the British, unlike most of the other colonies we've talked about. In fact, New York began from the Dutch. Henry Hudson, who you see a painting of him on the right, was an Englishman, actually, who was employed by the Dutch East India Company, and he sailed to Delaware and New York, traveled up the Hudson River, that's why it's named the Hudson River, in hopes of finding a shortcut through the continent and over, essentially to the Pacific Ocean to Asia. Of course, they didn't know the extent in 1609 of what the continent of North America was. Next, New Netherlands will be founded in 1623 on the Hudson River, and it's essentially established by the Dutch West India Company. They're both by the Dutch and they're both making money, for a quick profit fur trade. And New Netherlands will eventually lead. New Netherlands is the colony, and then New Amsterdam is going to be the town within that colony. New Netherlands, the colony, is the area of Manhattan Island, now known as New York City. Manhattan, a borough of New York City. It's about 22,000 acres. And they bought it. The Dutch did the Indians a dirty deal and bought it for about $30. So in the eyes of the Dutch, they're like, yeah, we got this for $30. In the eyes of the natives, they're like, we don't own the land, but we'll take your $30. But the Dutch ended up taking over a lot more territory in that New York area. Within that island of Manhattan, New Netherlands colony, we're going to get the city of New Amsterdam, which we know as New York City nowadays. It was founded as a company town for the Dutch East India Company or West India Company, and it was a seaport, so right on the Atlantic Ocean, easy for trade, easy for fishing and shipbuilding. In this colony, the Dutch had a very harsh control, little religious toleration, no freedom of speech, not much democratic practices. The colony was essentially run by and for the Dutch company and exists to make profit for the Dutch company. We have this idea of patroonship, which starts an aristocratic atmosphere in New York City that will continue. And this was a Dutch idea that promoters who promised to bring 50 people over, not as servants like the headright system, just bring 50 people over to live in the colony, would get huge estates of land. One of these actually ends up being even bigger than the state of Rhode Island. It's huge in upstate New York. So the Dutch will quickly settle New York via that method. Little fun fact about New York City / New Amsterdam is the same thing. It was run by and for the Dutch West India Company, and if you look on the map on the screen, this palisade means wall, oh there it is, the word wall, was meant to protect the Dutch from natives, and nowadays it's not standing anymore, but the idea of it is that's what today's Wall Street is. That's the exact position of Wall Street. So the Dutch first meet some resistance in this New York area by natives, so they build the wall, and then they meet some resistance from colonizers from Sweden who are trying to attempt to make colonies on the Delaware River, and they shut that down real quick and absorb their colonies. And next we get British New England, think like Connecticut, Massachusetts area, not happy that they're moving in. So actually in 1644, we're going to see the king grant his brother, the Duke of York, the British Duke of York, all the land from Connecticut to the Delaware Bay, which includes New York. Essentially, he dispatches a force that goes to New Amsterdam, knocks on the door, and says, guess what? We own you now. And without even firing a shot, Peter, I'm going to butcher his last name, Stuyvesant, surrenders to the British forces. Think they're on the island of Manhattan in what we now know as New York City, and a bunch of ships roll up ready to go for it, and they just give up without even firing a shot. They give in. So now the Duke of York takes over New Amsterdam, renames it New York. And the British have this empire that stretches from Maine, which wasn't actually Maine, it was New Hampshire and Massachusetts, all the way down to the Carolinas. We just haven't quite added Georgia yet. That's going to be the last colony. In this, they get the important Hudson River and the Hudson Harbor. So not only do they get a larger empire, but they get a huge trading port and a very cosmopolitan city for the day. And in the 1640s, 18 different languages were spoken in New Amsterdam. It was very chic, very aristocratic, now called New York. One thing about the Dutch cultural influence that still lives on, some things that we celebrate in our holidays and in our diet comes from Dutch culture, such as Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles. Some people eat sauerkraut, gross, and some sports such as bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf all come from Dutch culture. So when the King and the Duke of York take over the colony of New Amsterdam, rename it New York, they essentially take all political freedom and throw it down the toilet. So he doesn't want any representative assemblies. So the whole clamp down of the Duke of York and the King of England on New York with no taxation without representation and no rights. Eventually the colonists of New York essentially fight back, not fight, but like have strong opposition to that idea, and he will relent and actually establish the New York Chapter of Liberties in 1683. So essentially, this granted freedom of religion to all Christians, so no Jews, nothing like that, no agnostics, but just Christians, Protestants, and Catholics, and gave all freeholders the right to vote. And when I say freeholders, I mean those that are white, male, and own land. So it's still an aristocratic atmosphere. However, from their historical perspective, that is a step towards democracy. There are some limitations in that much of the land was in the hands of few landowners or speculators, so not that many people could vote. And New York kind of retains those feudal qualities where one man owns a lot of land and has a lot of servants and a lot of people that are under his care, more so than any other colony in the middle or north. It kind of has a tone of what the southern colonies look like. Large farms with one man in charge owning it. So some other miscellaneous New York stuff. When the Duke of York, the owner of New York, becomes king, then it becomes a royal colony because he's in charge and he makes all the money, all the profit, makes all the decisions for it. One of the kind of leftovers from Dutch colonization in this area is the idea of patroonship. Remember, large, vast feudal estates given to those that bring over 50 people to settle on it and usually work for them. So Leisler's rebellion will start because of this. Those aristocrats have all the land, and they're suppressing those poor whites and crowding them out, essentially not letting them get as much as they possibly could if those large patroonships, those large estates did not exist. So Jacob Leisler, who is a disgruntled German merchant, sides with these poor white farmers who just want some land, and essentially will try and overthrow the aristocrats, fails miserably. He's inspired by the overthrow of the Dominion of New England, and that's kind of how Leisler's rebellion starts. But he is hung, and the parceling out of huge estates from the king just continues. So it's just an example. The significance of it is it's an example of fighting back to that aristocratic atmosphere and essentially fighting back against the king in that manner, but it doesn't really pan out this time. Next middle colony we're going to talk about is founded in 1681 is Pennsylvania. The abbreviation is PA. And Pennsylvania is originally founded by the Quakers. It's a vast forest land that leads into the Appalachian Mountains until the Quakers, otherwise known as the Religious Society of Friends, move into there. So the Quakers have a different religion, and that's why they move away from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They believe in the equality of men and women. Whoop, first time that's happened in American history. Nonviolence and resistance to military service. They refuse to take an oath to any government. They refuse to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church or any Puritan churches. And so in that sense, they're nonconformist, and they're just a radical Protestant sect that break away. Essentially, they're simple, they're democratic, they lead simple lives, they don't have an overbearing government or church that's in charge of them that they pay taxes to like the Puritans. And one thing, a theology that they believe is different is they believe in an inner light. They didn't believe that the scripture or that bishops or priests or government leaders are in charge of your religion, are in charge of your connection to God. The inner light connects you to God, and that all men were equal in the eyes of God. And thus, they don't have elaborate churches or rituals or giant services or ministers. This church was started, here's an example. They also indulged in good relations with the natives, which is atypical of other societies. So, it was started by William Penn, and William Penn was essentially not okay with the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in 1681, he secured a huge grant from the king in order to build a colony because the king owed his dad some money for military service and other services. So he moves away from Massachusetts Bay Colony, buys this area of Pennsylvania. It's like forest land with a little bit of coastline. And his primary motive is finding a haven for Quakers to go to. So a lot of Quakers will leave those Puritan colonies and move to Pennsylvania. His secondary motive here is what we call the holy experiment. It's actually one of your vocab terms. The holy experiment is the idea that we can practice our religion, the Quakers, and other people can live in our colony as well. Religious toleration among the denominations. This is really liberal for the time. This is really, really radical to think that we can have complete religious toleration. The only other place we've seen this in the colonies is in Rhode Island. That was also an offshoot from the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Pennsylvania is one of the most advertised colonies of the time as well. Some people call William Penn America's first advertising man, America's first marketer. So he distributed countless pamphlets in England, in Holland, in France, in Germany, all in those respective languages, telling people about Pennsylvania, that there's land, that there's lumber, that there's fish, that there's propensity to grow things, that we have freedom of religion there, we tolerate all religions, that there's a representative government. And that actually attracts a lot of European immigrants, a lot of merchants as well as carpenters, masons, shoemakers, and other manual workers. So we'll see Pennsylvania turn into like this humming little colony of all these different little parts that come together and are able to live in peace because of the Quakers' idea of religious toleration. All right, so here we have William Penn, an actual print on the right, and then what we think is William Penn on the Quaker Oats advertisement there on the left. Oh, Quakers were actually not the first to be in the Pennsylvania area. 4,000, an estimated 4,000 squatters of Swedish, Finnish, Dutch, and Welsh descent were all throughout this area. And squatters means that they had no legal land claims through a charter or a colony. They didn't buy the land. They're just kind of living there. And that's the situation that William Penn moves into. He doesn't take it as we're going to kick you out because you're not my English nationality. Instead, he's a really cool dude. He quickly calls an assembly together because this is a legislative, like very democratic society, and they pass an act that organizes counties within Pennsylvania. And these counties allow people that are already living there to be considered citizens. So they're all immediately naturalized under Penn's charter. So William Penn takes his idea that I've bought this land, I have a charter from the king because he owed my dad some money. There are already people living here. I'm not going to kick them out. I'm going to make them legal citizens, which is a totally cool move. So all Swedes, Finnish, Dutch, Welsh in those areas become part of the Pennsylvania colony. He also will end up buying more land from natives and establishing a very good trade system with them. They foster excellent relations, all the Quakers do, with the natives. One thing that's pretty specific to this colony is like a really truly representative democracy government. The church, their Quaker idea of religion, was not tax supported, very different from Massachusetts Bay. There's freedom of worship guaranteed to all residents. One thing that's different from other colonies is those taxes that they would take weren't put towards military defense because that's against the Quaker pacifist doctrine. They're not going to fight, so they're not even going to build up a military. And it ends up being no issue for them. And they're also very strongly against slavery. By 1700, Pennsylvania is going to be the fourth largest colony, preceded only by Virginia, Massachusetts, and Maryland. But it's slowly making its way through. Philadelphia is a booming city. It's very well planned, very good block structure, as well as a good government structure. Quakers were shrewd businessmen. They saved their money instead of spend. That's part of their peace and simplicity idea. And they are also very good at making a lot of money through exportation of grains and lumber. And a lot of Germans will end up migrating to Pennsylvania, and that's why lots of people from there are of German descent nowadays. All right, so New Jersey is very simple. Essentially, just kidding. New Jersey is very simple. Essentially, New Jersey is originally like this Quaker territory around the Delaware River, and the king will take New Jersey. The king, who was the Duke of York, but then he becomes the king, will take New Jersey and split it into two areas and give it to two different people. But the issues cropped up of confusion of which one is West New Jersey and which one is East New Jersey. So eventually they just combine it when he becomes king in 1702, and it becomes our New Jersey that we know today. Delaware's nice and easy too. It started as part of the lower three counties that William Penn added to Pennsylvania to make those people legal because he's a cool dude. They formed their own General Assembly, and essentially they will become a separate colony, but they will be under the provision of Pennsylvania. So technically they're Delaware, they're their own colony, but Pennsylvania is like their mama until the American Revolution. And as such, because they're part of Pennsylvania for so long, there's many Quakers living in Delaware and lots of Germans as well. So like I said before, the middle colonies are very similar in some ways to the North and South and very different in some ways to the North and South. They will have struggles when it comes to lower, middle, and upper class, just like the other colonies. So the middle colonies, there's more frontier, and by frontier I mean undeveloped land, especially as you move closer to the interior and closer to the Appalachian Mountains. On the frontier, it's just so egalitarian that there's not many class struggles. There's few distinctions because we're all just trying to survive out there. And closer to the coast, upper class pretensions are kind of resented because of that spirit we get from being close to that egalitarian frontier kind of society. Those that come to this area and take a lot of land, with the exception of New York, are mostly stopped from reproducing that aristocratic European atmosphere because there were so many diverse amounts of middle and lower class people there, and so much democratic institutions, like truly democratic institutions, it was hard for those aristocrats to take over because people just vote against them. The regular common man would vote against them. We also see a rising middle class in the middle colonies because of the instance of trading. There's lots of trading, and that makes people merchants, which are kind of seen as above the small farmers, but below those large landholders and like factory manufacturing owners. So thinking about all the colonies as a whole, and specifically the middle colonies, we still have a very large rural society. 80% of colonists are farmers by the American Revolution, by the 1770s. And as farmers, you kind of delve into traditional gender roles. Women, they work very, very hard, but not outside the home. Cloth weaving, cooking, cleaning, raising children, as well as livestock and some farming. Men fell into the role of clearing land on the frontier, putting up fences, planting, harvesting crops, cutting firewood, taking care of livestock, killing livestock for food, breeding livestock. Your typical farm tasks are going to fall into the men's basket. And children, there's a lot less educational institutes in the South and in the middle than in the North. So children will fall into the task of just helping and some school if possible. Most of that school in the middle and southern colonies will be homeschool, being taught how to read and write by your mother, which wasn't as common. And then we'll have in the North more institutions of public school. But the cool thing about living in the colonies at this time is, for the most part, you had a higher standard of living than those in Europe. They're running out of room, they're running out of food in Europe. Compared to most 17th century Europeans, Americans just live longer during this time period. And that's due to the idea of there's land available. It's kind of cheap, mostly in the middle, not in the South, because we have those large landowners. And wages were up. The wage of a European merchant compared to an American merchant is much better because the trade is up in the colonies. Wages were about 3 times that of in Europe. So living in the colonies, even though it was really, really difficult in the beginning, getting into the 17th century, it's going to be so much better than in the beginning, and so much better than living in Europe. All right. So we're going to be reviewing this in class, so make sure you bring your notes and all handwritten outlines we have done thus far in class. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Have a great day.